Personally, I think the concept of drug consumption rooms are good. I mean, clearly a town like Bournemouth, we've got a lot of drug issues, and there's a lot of drug users in the community, and we see the evidence on a daily basis of needles lying around all over the streets, people sleeping in doorways out of their heads with drug consumption. So I think if there was a controlled way of these people taking their drugs and cleaning the whole thing up, it would be a lot better. Well, as you probably know, it's quite a new concept in this country, and I don't think there's any up and running active drug consumption rooms at present. And I know Brighton Council have looked at it a few years ago, and I think Southampton Council are currently considering it. But we've got to look at whether they work or not in the context of the national laws on drug use and drug consumption and drug possession. Um, I think it's something that the council should look at, and as a result of the discussion we're having today, and it's sowed the seeds in my mind as something to have a look at and certainly ask questions about, because I wouldn't be averse to the idea. I think so. Looking up on this subject, I noticed that the first one I think was opened back in 1986 in Switzerland, and there was concern at the time about what might happen. But I think by and large it's worked very well since then. There isn't any evidence of increased drug use in the area, and the authorities seem to be quite comfortable with it. And I've noticed all around the world, in Australia, Canada, lots of countries in Europe, they're now doing this with various mixed results. But I think by and large, the experiment seems to be successful. Whether or not this would have to be consulted with the government, I don't know. I don't know enough about this sort of thing. But at the very least, wherever this was going to be, it would have to get planning permission from the local council, I would think. And I could imagine that stirring up a hornet's nest in itself, because even having things like homeless shelters causes problems, and wet houses for people with alcohol problems. They always cause problems in the local community because the local people all think it's going to bring their neighbourhood down. So it's a huge issue to investigate, but I certainly think it's worth looking at. I think there's enough open-minded colleagues of mine, who will be open to the idea of considering it. And it's something that I will, before I sort of float the idea politically and generally, I would talk to our professionals behind the scenes just to find out what the current situation is, what the legislation is, and so on. So that would be the first step. I know in my ward, not far from in the Lansdowne, we've had a homeless shelter there, slightly different, but a lot of people in the homeless shelter were drug addicts, and of course they used to go out on the streets doing their drugs. And when that was there in full flow, that caused a lot of problems in the neighbourhood because people naturally gravitated towards that building, and friends would come round and all sorts. And so when it was finally changed, the community breathed a sigh of relief. So I'm well aware, and I've got the scars to show how this can affect the community. Well, the only thing that's gone through my mind in having this conversation is whether society should go one step further. And whilst I wouldn't say legalise drugs, whether people who are heroin, coke, or whatever addicts should get their prescriptions, from the government, so that they can be given their drugs in a controlled manner, basically free of charge, because that in turn would save an awful lot of crime. I think when you look at the statistics, probably 80% plus of people in prison are there because of drugs. So if we could take away the criminal aspects of drug taking, it would do away with the drug dealers, it would do away with the drug importers, it would probably sort out a lot of international crime. If the whole world went sort of legalising with drugs, it could be grown in a controlled way in Colombia or wherever, shipped legally, processed rather like drugs are now for people with mental health problems or cancer or anything else. So I think that's something that most politicians wouldn't be brave enough to look at the moment. So I think that will have to stay on the back burner, to be honest. Yeah, absolutely. It certainly needs another way of looking at the whole subject, and come back to what I said just now. It does beg the question whether drugs should be legalised. And I noticed in the States now that they are legalising cannabis, and there are cannabis farms turning up everywhere, and people can buy it legally and smoke it legally. So it does beg the question if that's the first step on legalising drugs.